right, morning, everybody. I'll open this up in prayer this morning. Father God, thank you for bringing us together to worship you. I pray that you would give us an attitude of worship and praise, and that we would put aside the worries or the things that populate our mind. Help us to put those aside and focus on you today. Pray that you would be with those who are traveling or absent. And thank you for all the blessings and the trials that you provide us. Amen. All right. So was it last weekend? Yeah. Last weekend we were looking at the abomination of desolation, because we've been studying judgment, and the abomination of desolation is a indicator, as Matthew describes it, of when this great tribulation kicks off. So, which is the judgment or the tribulations accredited to the seven seals mentioned in Revelation. So we've been discussing what the abomination of desolation is. Or actually, last weekend we described or talked about why it occurred. So if you remember, those of you who were here, we read Isaiah 64. So Isaiah 64, verse 4 through 6. So this is speaking to the state of Israel. I think in particular during the Babylonian exile. So if you remember, Babylon utterly destroyed the temple. The temple had become it was similar to a stumbling block for Israel. So they were, if you remember King Hezekiah, in his response, he touted all the riches that he had stored up in the temple. We read Daniel 9, which talks about Israel turning away from God's commandments, and they ignored the teachings of the prophets. And Israel no longer called upon their God. So the temple had become a place of sin. You know, the purpose of the temple was no longer there. They used the temple in ways that they weren't supposed to. So because of their disobedience, and to basically clean the slate on the function of the temple, it was destroyed. So then
Did you say that was the abomination of desolation?
no, that is not abomination, desolation. And Isaiah 64, as well as Daniel 9, as we talked, is essentially like a double prophecy. So it's like the same event repeats itself. So let's read Matthew 23. So by this time, obviously the temple's been rebuilt. If you remember in our study in, was it Jeremiah, or was, I'm trying to remember, I think it was in Jeremiah. So that Zerubbabel was one of the leaders that led Israel back into Jerusalem, and they were given time to rebuild the temple. So they rebuilt the temple a second time, but it wasn't to its former glory. And then under Herod the Great, they finally completed the temple. So Israel had basically been able to partake in their daily sacrifices. Their worship system was reinstituted, and then we pick up in Matthew 23, and we see the state of Israel and the leaders. So starting in verse 1, says, Then Yeshua addressed the crowds in his Taladim, the Torah teachers and the Prushim. He said, Sit in the seat of Moses, so whatever they tell you, take care to do it, but don't do what they do, because they talk but don't act. They tie heavy loads onto people's shoulders, but won't lift a finger to help carry them. Everything they do is done to see by others, for they make their phylactery, which is we talked about that, it's like a small leather box where they would put little notes on things that they had to observe in the law. So make their phylactery broad and their garments long. They love the place of honor and banquets, or the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues. And they love being greeted differentially in marketplaces and being called rabbi. But you are not to let yourselves be called rabbi, because you have one rabbi and you are all each other's brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, because you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to let yourself be called leaders, because you have one leader, and he is the Messiah. The greatest among you must be your servant, for whomever promotes himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be promoted. But woe to you, hypocritical Torah teachers and Prushim, for you are shutting the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, neither entering yourselves nor allowing those who wish to enter to do so. Woe to you, hypocritical Torah teachers and Prushim! You go about over the land and sea to make one proselyte, and when you succeed, you make him twice as fit for Gehenna as you are. Woe to you, you blind guides! You say, if someone swears by the temple, he is not bound by his oath, but if he swears by the gold in the temple, he is bound. You blind fools, which is more important, the gold or the temple? Which makes the gold holy? And you say, if someone swears by the altar, he is not bound by his oath, but if he swears by the offering on the altar, he is bound. Blind men, which is more important, the sacrifice or the altar which makes the sacrifice holy? So someone who swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And someone who swears by the temple swears by it and the one who lives in it. And someone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and the one who sits on it. Woe to you, hypocritical Torah teachers and Prushim! You pay your tithes of mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the weightier matters of the Torah. Justice, mercy, trust, these are the things you should have attended to, without neglecting the others. Blind guides straining out a gnat, meanwhile swallowing a camel. So I could keep going on, but so what is the state of the religious leaders in Israel at this point? What's that?
Shallow, materialistic.
Yeah, they're putting too much emphasis on material matters.
Yeah.
Or not really focusing on God.
Right.
Like they're supposed to.
Yeah. Indicative where it says to swear by the gold in the temple instead of the gold, right? Putting value in monetary things over the temple. And that's what they were doing, right, when Jesus overturned the table in the temple, right? They were making profit off of sacrifices. So the temple had become they were desecrating the temple. It had become a stumbling block for Israel. Said the leaders were leading, that their teachings were leading people to Gehenna. That's how corrupt they were. So I wonder, well, how did they get to that point? I mean, they when they were finally released from exile from Babylon, they rebuilt the temple. When you read in like Ezra and Nehemiah, they were honored to be able to have, a temple to once again institute their sacrificial system. So in a matter of, I think, what was that, 400 years, 300 years? They went from that to the attitude that we read in Matthew 23. So how did they get to that point? Yeah. So pull out. So most of Israel turned away from God's covenant and the laws of Moses, and they adopted, at this point, they had adopted the laws of the Gentiles. Their traditions were systematically changed and conformed to Greek beliefs prior to this. So they had, well, we'll get into that. So a lot of the leaders started implementing Gnosticism and cosmology into their writings, into their Hebrew scripture, through the influence of the Greeks. And then there was a rivalry between the priesthood to, who would become the high priest within Jerusalem, and that was between a fellow by the name of Onias and Jason. So because the position was valued so highly, Onias, who lost his position or lost the election to that position, they actually set up a second temple in Egypt. So Onias moved down there and became a high priest in Egypt. So there was conflict within the priesthood. And a lot of this was in no small part due to Antiochus Epiphanes. Through Antiochus Epiphanes, which he ruled, or he lived between 215 and 164 BC, he ruled heavily over Israel. And because of that, many Israelites forsake their covenant with God. So they made a covenant with the Gentiles in order to give themselves a form of freedom away from Antiochus' rule, with the promise to practice ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built places of worship and business within Jerusalem according to the laws of Gentiles. And as we'll read in 1 Maccabees, it states that the Israelites made themselves uncircumcised and forsook the Holy Covenant by joining the Gentiles and selling themselves to do evil. Where's my Hellenization? Yep. What's that? Yeah.
It's more effective than moving them, which is what everybody did up to that point.
So I think the main point that I want to kind of relay as to why the abomination of desolation will happen or did happen, we haven't got to the timeline yet, was primarily because of Israel's disobedience. It's not so much God's judgment on the world, it's his way of purifying the his people, Israel. All right. So, what is the abomination of desolation? So, we do you all agree as to why the abomination of desolation occurred or will occur in the scriptures we've read?
I doubt we all agree on anything. Can you rephrase the question?
Why did the abomination of desolation occur? Or why will it occur? What is it centered around? The abomination of desolation. The temple, right? The temple became a stumbling block for Israel, right? Become desecrated. So, similar to the first temple, which became a stumbling block to Israel, it was desecrated. So God abolished it and rebuilt a new one. So what is the abomination of desolation? What is an abomination besides Hulk's adversary?
A thing that should not be.
Something brings great shame. Okay. Something disgusting. It's often in reference to idolatry, right? Abomination. Something unacceptable sacrifice or filthy sacrifice.
I've only heard it paired with disgust or revulsion. Something that's
Yeah.
undesirable.
Something that's opposite of what it should be, or something that takes place that's
Yeah.
opposite of
Its
what it
purpose has been
should be.
corrupted.
Completely the other way.
Yeah. So, what's desolation?
Desolate.
Desolate.
Empty.
Complete emptiness. So Matthew says abomination of desolation. I think, well, Daniel 11 phrases it, I think, would more accurately, and it says the abomination that leads to desolation. So there's a
Greek in Matthew is the abomination. Make it desolate.
yeah, it's abomination that leads to desolation. So there's something unclean that leads to something to be desolate.
Well, not necessarily unclean.
What's that?
Not necessarily unclean.
Something opposite of its purpose
Something
is happening at the temple. Remember, it's centered around the temple. All right, I'm gonna read 1 Maccabees 20 through 64.
You got it right here. What chapter?
I got it. Oh, do you want to read it?
I'll read it. What chapter?
Chapter 1, 20 through 64. Unless yours is laid out a little different.
KJA.
So first off, does everybody know what Maccabees is? What is it, Holly?
They're part of what they call the apocryphal writings. They're writings that happen between the end of Malachi and
Well, didn't the Latin Bible, wasn't it canonized in the Latin Bible?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's been Catholic
I think
versions.
Paul's got it in his Bible.
Because they had it.
So the Maccabees were brothers, if I'm not mistaken, right? They led a revolt against Rome.
The Maccabean revolt.
Yeah.
The two brothers.
Was it Rome or Greece? Can't remember.
Greece.
Greece, yeah. There was another revolt against Rome, but not the Maccabees.
That was later. Or later.
Yeah, way later. All right, go ahead.
And after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 143rd year, and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude, entered proudly into the sanctuary, and took away the golden altar, and the candlestick of light, and all the vessels thereof, and the table of the showbread, and the pouring vessels, and the vials, and the censers of gold, and the veil, and the crown, and the golden ornaments that were before the temple, all which he pulled off. He took also the silver and the gold and the precious vessels. Also he took the hidden treasures which he found. And when he had taken all away, he went into his own land, having made a great massacre, and spoke very proudly. Therefore there was great mourning in Israel, and every place where they were, so that the princes and elders mourned, the virgins and young men were made feeble, and the beauty of women was changed. Every bridegroom took up lamentation, and she that sat in the marriage chamber was in heaviness. The land also was moved for the inhabitants thereof, and all the house of Jacob was covered with confusion. And after 2 years fully expired, okay, the king sent his chief collector of tribute unto the cities of Judah, who came up to Jerusalem with a great multitude, and spoke peaceable words unto them, but all was deceit, for when they had given him credence, he fell suddenly upon the city, and smote it very sore, and destroyed much people of Israel. I love King James. He smote it very sore.
Mm-hmm.
And when they had taken the spoils of the city, he set it on fire, and pulled down the houses and walls thereof on every side. But the women and children took they captive, and possessed the cattle. Then builded they the city of David with a great and strong wall, and with mighty towers, and made it a stronghold for them. And they put therein a sinful nation, wicked men, and fortified themselves therein. They stored it also with armor and victuals. When they had gathered together the spoils of Jerusalem, they laid them up there, so that they became a sore snare. For it was a place to lie in wait against the sanctuary, and an evil adversary to Israel. Thus they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary, and defiled it, insomuch that the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them, whereupon the city was made an habitation of strangers, and became strange to those that were born in her, and her own children left her. Her sanctuary was laid waste like a wilderness, her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into reproach, her honor into contempt. As had been her glory, so was her dishonor increased, and her excellency was turned into mourning. Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that it should be one people, and every one should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Thus we are beginning Hellenization.
Mm-hmm.
Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messenger unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts. But they should also leave their children uncircumcised, and make their lives abominable with all manner of uncleanness, and profanation, to the end they might forget the law and change all the ordinances. And whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die.
I'll finish off this. According to all these words wrote he to his whole kingdom, and he appointed overseer over all the people, and he commanded the cities of Judah to sacrifice city by city, and from the people who gathered together unto them many, every one that had forsaken the law, and they did evil things in the land, and they made Israel to hide themselves in every place and refuge they had. So Antiochus Epiphanes was at this time, so this is around, I think, 160 BC, 150, yeah, between 150 and 160 BC. So Antiochus Epiphanes is warring with two major powers right now: Egypt, which was under King Ptolemy, and which we'll read in Daniel's referring to the king of the south, and then Rome is also appearing on stage as well, which we'll read. They hold many of the islands in the Mediterranean at this point.
Antiochus is the king of the Seleucid dynasty. Right?
Yeah, Seleucid, Greece. Yep. So he was looked after by Philip after his dad Antiochus the IV passed away, I think, something like that. So he's waging war with Egypt. He returns. Jerusalem is kind of in a strategic location. So he builds up the city. Some of the writings refer to it as a war machine or a war engine. Basically a central location, a citadel, where Jerusalem becomes basically a headquarter for warring operations. Yeah. So now that we read that, I'll read, and then, so he enters into Jerusalem. He convinces many Jews to leave the Holy Covenant and enter into an agreement to follow the covenants of Antiochus. So you have a corruption of Jewish leaders, or many Jewish people. So they are Hellenized. What else? What are some of the key points? And then many of Israel was basically either crucified, slaughtered, or starved out. So keep that in mind.
And what do you remember? I sort of do. What was the quote unquote religion that they were supposed to convert to?
It was Zeus was their main god. So I'll get into that.
Okay.
Daniel chapter 11. Verse 21 through 39. Do I have a volunteer to read? Daniel chapter 11, verse 21 through 39.
Cool.
Go ahead, Corey.
He will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. When the richest province feels secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among the followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. With a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings and their hearts bent on evil will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come to the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up an abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Those who will rise will instruct many. Through for a time they will fall by the sword, or be burned, or captured, or plundered. How far?
Go to 39.
When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. From the wise will stumble, some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the end of time. Till the time of end, sorry. And for it will still come at the appointed time. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things. Will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors, or for the one desired by woman, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his ancestor. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people, and will distribute the land at a price.
Okay. So in Daniel 11, so we have this king of the north waging war against this king of the south. If you remember, we read in Maccabees, Antiochus Epiphanes is waging war, or Greece is waging war with Egypt. Verse 30, it says, because of the ships of Kittim, which were, Kittim was in the, I think it's part of Macedonia, so it was out in the Mediterranean, which was a region controlled by what would become Rome, or I think it was Rome at the time. So they've got aspects of Rome and Egypt that Antiochus is dealing with. It says, where'd it go? So he steals. He will show favor for. Yeah, go ahead. Oh. He will show favor for those who profane or who abandon the holy covenant. So he will lead many Israelites astray. He will abolish the daily burnt offerings, so he will remove their daily sacrificial system. And he will actually set up his own idolatry within the temple. And then it says, there'll be a, where was that? It says, when in verse 34, when they stumble, they will receive a little help, although many who will join them will be insincere. So, even some of those with discernment will stumble, so that some of them will be refined. So, if you remember, I mentioned Odius and Jason were the two. Onias and Jason were two guys that were, kind of battling for the priesthood. So Jason took office as the high priest in Jerusalem during this time, and he had received support from the anti-Hellenistic Jews, so the Jews that were against being Hellenized by Greece. He received support from, but they were eventually utterly destroyed by Antiochus. So Antiochus murdered or slaughtered many of the anti-Hellenistic Jews, including Jason. So the high priest was slaughtered by Antiochus. So Antiochus, anybody know what Epiphanes means? Manifestation of. It means manifestation of. So Antiochus saw himself as a manifestation of Zeus. So he started seeing himself as a god. So he entered the Holy of Holies. He removed the holy instruments, and even did so with help from from the Jews. So many of the Jews who were Hellenized sided with him and removed the articles of the temple. He established, as we mentioned, a covenant with Israel to lead them astray. He had converted Jerusalem to a stronghold for war against Egypt and Rome. And then in 168 BC, he dedicated the temple of Zeus and erected an image of Zeus on the altar. So he set up an idol in the Holy of Holies on the altar.
Kind of a theoretical question, but why is it like if you're a regular Jew and you went into the Holy of Holies, you're gonna die?
Uh-huh.
But heathens can go in, or somebody that's betrayed him, and they're not. I mean, I'm not saying they're not gonna get their judgment, but why is it? This is pre-Christ, and still pretty important to enter the Holy of Holies, like really important. So why wasn't it not?
Well, going back to why did this abomination happen?
Oh, okay, there you go.
And this is part of the process of cleaning out the temple.
Gotcha.
I shouldn't say cleaning. wiping it out because it became a corrupt system for Israel. So, does that sound like an abomination to you? To have a foreign king, a Gentile, enter in the Holy of Holies and set up an idol of his God and force Israel to worship that idol on the Holy of Holies? What's that?
She said that.
Disgusting, yeah. So Daniel 11, even though it mentions the abomination that leads to desolation, it doesn't so much describe a complete destruction of the temple. But when you turn to Matthew 24, so this is after he's set and described how hypocritical and vile the religious leaders of Israel are in Matthew 23. In Matthew 24, verse 1, he says, as Yeshua left the temple and was going away, his Talmudim came and called his attention to its buildings. But he answered them and said, you see all of these. Yes, I tell you, they will be totally destroyed. Not a single stone will be left standing. And when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the Talmudim came to him privately and tell us. They said, when all these things happen, and what will be the sign that you are coming, and that the Olam Hazeh is ending. So this is where he gets into the preparation for this abomination of desolation and this great tribulation. So he says the temple will be completely destroyed, not a single stone will be left standing. So obviously, it doesn't appear in Matthew 23 that the religious leaders it's not as bad as it was described in Daniel 11, right? So they were able to somewhat they returned to the daily sacrifices. That's indicative of, Jesus entering the temple. Obviously, the system was still corrupt because they were trying to make, profit from it. But, during that time period between Antiochus Epiphanes and Matthew 23, they were able to kind of bring it back around somewhat. The third temple.
Really the second one.
Yeah, so the third temple was rebuilt by Herod with a huge wall garrison surrounding it. So they got somewhat back to their, sacrificial system. But Jesus says that this temple will be finally utterly destroyed. So anybody remember what year the temple was destroyed? 70 AD, right? So on the back end of, I'd say the Maccabees were, pretty were instrumental in bringing the Israel back to a proper worship system in between Daniel 11 and Matthew 23. But obviously it became corrupted. So then after Yeshua died, after the Messiah was raised, around 66 AD, there was another Jewish revolt, similar to what the Maccabees led. So instead of the Maccabees led a revolt against Greece, and I forget who led the revolt, the second revolt. Bar Jesus?
No,
Bar-
no. I know who you're talking about though. We watched that, was it you that did that timeline that was like a little walking path of, was that a school thing?
That might have been the history. Is that the history of the?
There, yeah,
Church?
there was the,
Yeah.
the history of the Jews.
The circle thing?
Yeah, and it kind of walked along the different iterations of the temples and its destruction. Was that you, Joe? I'm sorry.
I think that was him. I
My
think it
I
was
don't
Joe.
remember.
I'm
I'm like, that doesn't sound familiar.
Yeah.
I don't think it was me, but I'm old.
There was
I forgot.
pictures with it.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, I don't remember who led the revolt, but the Jews led a revolt against Rome this time, and in response, so the Jews were, trying to gain their independence from Rome, and in response, the Romans retaliated against them, and I think what I read, there was an approximate 1 million Jews that were killed either through starvation, crucifixion, murder,
Bar Kokhba?
bar kokhba.
Simon Bar Kokhba.
Never remember that.
So after this revolt, on the month of Av, which is around the July-August timeframe, which ironically is the same month that the first temple was destroyed by Babylon. In the year 70 AD, a Roman legion demolished the temple, all except for the west wall, which is still standing. And that Roman legion at the time would have been made up primarily of Arabs from Syria. Most of the Roman legions in that area during this time period were made up of Syrians. So something to keep in mind. Yeah, which we'll get into in a few weeks. So I'm out of time. So to review, the abomination, which is Antiochus setting up or abolishing the worship system, Israel's worship system, setting up his own idol on the altar in the Holy of Holies. So that would be, what I would call the abomination, which eventually led to the desolation of the temple. But remembering that this desolation is primarily caused because Israel, the Jews, had corrupted the purpose of the temple. Its purpose no longer served what it was originally entitled for.
It's a theme we see a lot. Get rid of the useless thing.
Yeah. Any comments or questions so far? So next weekend we'll look at, so we know, and hopefully we understand why, what it is. So we'll look at when it is. When is the abomination of desolation? I mean, we have already kind of talked about what, you kind of get that sense already by talking about what it was, but but it will help you when you read Daniel 9, when it starts talking about the 7 weeks and the 70 weeks and help you kind of understand what exactly it's talking about. Yeah. And ironically, I think Antiochus Epiphanes was based out of Babylon. I think that's where he was home based.
Was he one of Alexander's?
So you
Yes.
said,
Because it broke up into 4.
Right. So his father, Antiochus Epiphanes' father, I think came out of that breakup. And then his father died or was assassinated, I can't remember.
Probably.
And so,
yeah, there was a couple of things in between, like real short.
yeah. So I think his father charged Philip, I forget Philip's last name, to basically raise Antiochus to kind of form him into a king. So there was some kings in between him, his father dying and him taking the reign.
He didn't have any legitimate heirs, so when he died, his empire was divided amongst his 4 generals, and they left to peace.
All right. That's all I got. Any comments or questions? Thank you.